Hello, thank you for joining Dragos today as we talk through our year in review report we issued back in February, focused on lessons learned from hunting and responding. A couple logistics before we get started. So we are recording this session. So if you need to refer back to it later, or if you'd like to share it with a coworker, we are indeed recording it, and it will be posted on the Dragos website later this week. And also, there's a chat box where you can go ahead and ask questions. Feel free to ask those questions throughout the presentation, and then at the end, we'll go through and answer any questions we can, certainly barring any time that we have remaining. With that, my name is Ben Miller. So I lead the Threat Operations Center here at Dragos. And then today with me as well is Mark Stacey. He's one of the team leads within the Threat Operations Center. But before I turn it over to Mark, I wanted to kind of open this up and explain some of the thought process and where this has come from, and some of the things that didn't quite make it into the report. Starting at the very beginning, when Dragos started, it was the idea of how much good can we do. So safeguarding civilization, a little slogan that we have. But what that means to us is not that we're just elevating and adding value to our customers, but we're also bringing it back to the community overall. So that's why you'll see us at a lot of conferences, doing presentations as well as doing training sessions, and why we do the year in review report. So the other two reports that we've issued, this is actually the second year that we've issued the year in review reports, and it's become a pattern where we've released 3 or 4 of them. The other 2 that we've released, one is focused on activity groups and/or threats that really have a desire or have demonstrated a capability on targeting industrial control systems. And then the second one is the analysis of vulnerabilities and the vulnerability reports that are out there that are pertinent to the industrial control system space. But this call is really focused on the hunting and response capability actions that we've done over the course of 2018. While Mark will get into a lot of the discussions around what's in the report, the background for all that. So Dragos is a technology company first and foremost, but my team, the Threat Operations Center, are the ones that are doing the flyaway teams and the threat hunting, as well as some of the assessments and proactive work on these engagements. So that's what's really instilled into this report. So while the title is Hunting and Responding, we actually grew quite a bit into some of the other services offerings over the course of 2018, and Mark will get into that when he works through some of the proactive services and lessons learned from that. But really the goal of the year in review is to take the experience and redirect it to the community. We are focused on getting past the anecdotal data that we have of an attack occurred in 2017, an attack occurred in 2014, and move past those headlines and start creating an empirical data set that's out there for the community leverage. So I'll let Mark speak to that in a moment. But prior, and while I'm on my little soapbox, one of the things that didn't make it into the report was something that generally, something that we were doing across all of our engagements, and not quite realizing that and identifying it and have been developed that into a process. And that's really on our approach of understanding the facilities process that we're walking into, and really what the potential outcomes, the potential consequences could be from that process. So whether we're doing IR or hunt or assessments, we really, before we're walking into that engagement, we're asking ourselves, what does a bad day look like for this facility? So a lot of that thought and concept is adapted in 2018. And internally, we're calling that the reverse triangle. But really a better or a good definition for that would be kind of a black box analysis from a consequence approach. So essentially what we would do is, independently of working with the client, we would start doing research into the particular facility, and we'd start combining a lot of the the classic IT risk methodologies that are out there that have been standardized for years, and combining that with classic engineering approaches as well. So that when we were coming on site and already bringing in potential crown jewels for the industrial process, and starting that conversation of the activity groups that we're tracking and how those activity groups TTP could create a hypothetical kill chain against those against those crown jewels. Those were the discussions that originally led to a white paper actually that we posted last, I believe, fall time frame that Mark, Rob, and I wrote, called the Collection Management Framework. So that it's really focused on the not only the crown jewels, but the visibility from a security operations perspective on those crown jewels. So really, whether we're focused on ransomware or we're focused on activity groups, the two key questions that have been a reoccurring theme in our engagement. So one, what are the functional dependencies that are in the system itself to create a particular set of consequences, generally bad consequences? And then the second question, what kind of visibility do I have to understand and hopefully defend against such an event before the actual consequence actually occurs? So the focus of visibility has almost been accidentally forgotten about. I think as we've focused on prevention and redeploying and re-architecting these systems, we didn't necessarily instrument visibility into these environments, which is where hunting and incident response come into play quite a bit, where we actually accidentally scoped away of tools that are available to us in order to properly respond. So with that, the idea of consequence analysis and doing it in a black box setting and starting that discussion, you'll be seeing more of that dialogue from Dragos in the next quarter or so as we finalize our white paper towards that. But the focus there, we're not the first ones to start talking about consequence analysis, but the angle that we've been focused on is really adding that value from creating conversations between all the various stakeholders, whether it's engineering or OT or IT, because there's something in there for all of those in that sort of discussion. So expect more on that. Let me also kick it over to Mark Stacey. So Mark, as I said, is one of the team leads within the Threat Operations Center. But and while many of us within the talk worked on the year in review report and contributed a lot to it, Mark certainly was one of the key drivers to that and got it over the finish line. So thank you, Mark, on completing that report. But now I will kick it back over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. So as Ben mentioned, the Threat Operations Center collectively kind of contributed to this report to push it out to the industry. We released our first year-end report in 2018 that focused on services completed in 2017. And now we're releasing 2019, which is looking at the 2018 report. So the data that we're looking at came from all services completed in 2018. And taking a cursory look at how those broke down across the different service offerings we have, we completed about a third of our engagements on incident response. Now, this could include rapid response, which is where the client has a potential issue or perceived infection, and we don't have a prior relationship with them, and so we get deployed to facilitate the triage and response process. It also includes our incident response retainer, which is a contractual term, generally a year. They carry service level agreements and access to a hotline. It's kind of enabling the organization to reach out as needed for assistance. So about a third of our engagements were in this space. I think that's a point that we'll focus on later on in the presentation when we talk about the threat landscape to ICS now being acknowledged. It's no longer conceptual or hypothetical. We have multiple case studies and data from the field that these devices are being targeted. Another third of our engagements were what we call threat view. This is our proactive threat hunting type of service. When we go into the environment, generally there's no malicious intent identified or perceived adversary presence, but we're brought in to confirm that and validate that the network is defensible and no current infections underway. The remaining third of our engagements were split between assessments, which could be architecture assessments, looking at the network topology and flow of information. Penetration tests also fit under assessments. Managed defense and response, which is where we have our platform deployed and we have remote access to that platform to do periodic queries and proactive threat hunting. And then finally, tabletop engagements. We broke these down into proactive and responsive or reactive type engagements. And I think this is one of the more interesting metrics that came out of 2018 was we looked at almost exactly an 80-20 split. One thing to note, at the very top and very bottom of the slide, you'll notice IR retainers are under proactive and responsive. And that's because when a client reaches out to us to set up an IR retainer, generally that is purely proactive. They haven't perceived an adversary presence. They're enabling their team to have assistance on hand as needed. Now, as those hours get used for either triage or a full-blown IR incident, that is responsive. That, in our minds, is now calculated as a responsive effort, because if we look at our total resource allocation, is it completely proactive or reactive? The IR retainer is one service where we really needed to break that out into both fields. So looking at all types of engagements, aggregating the questions together, aggregating the positive messages and areas of improvement across, we came up with initially 3 positive deductions or positive things that the community is doing well. The first is that information is being shared. Communities are built within verticals, within regions, and people are talking. Prior to coming to Dragos, I did incident response for 7 or 8 years in the IT space. And throughout all of that time, I presented multiple times on setting up a sustainable information sharing program, trying to help communities talk and set up those data sharing platforms. If we say we'll pick on the financial sector a little bit, they have FS-ISAC, they have some other federally funded programs, but there are very little grassroots efforts. There's not a lot of camaraderie between organizations. And so I think this is one area where the IT landscape really struggles. And I think this is one area the ICS landscape is doing very, very well. Even in competitive markets, companies are talking. And it's indicative when we do an engagement for one client in a vertical. At the conclusion of that engagement, 2 or 3 other clients in the same vertical will immediately reach out for a similar service. Now that works both ways. If we don't do successful, they're talking. But aside from the motivation and drive to succeed, it's very indicative that people are sharing information. And I think that's one of the primary benefits that came out of 2018 that was very evident. Secondly, vendors get oftentimes a little bit beat up that they're not being proactive or building security in from the ground everywhere that they could be. And what we have seen is a very good response from vendors. When we do penetration tests, hardware device testing, a lot of times we will discover vulnerabilities, either legacy backdoors or some protocol vulnerability in the device. We communicate that to the client, and when approved, when appropriate, we'll escalate it up to the vendor directly. And we've seen multiple instances where the vendors are very cooperative. They want us to help them improve. They want to improve. Additionally, we've had multiple vendors reach out for services directly. If we are evaluating a manufacturer supply line where circuit boards are printed, or looking at a supply chain issue where they host firmware for their clients to download updates. So we've seen multiple vendors reach out and engage us directly, worried about their own security and how they can improve the service to their clients. And finally, we talked about this a little bit before, and we'll focus on it throughout. The industry, I think, now acknowledges the threat landscape. A little bit more than 52% of our engagements, however, were focused on clients understanding their own landscape. They know the threats are out there. And as they start looking at their own network, they realize to really detect threats, they have to understand what they're trying to protect. themselves, what they are trying to defend. Some other key takeaways. The first, and we've talked about this previously, and that is that cyber is often guilty until proven innocent. We were brought into multiple engagements where under a rapid response type engagement or under incident response retainer hours, where again, there is no malicious intent. There was no evidence an adversary was present. Either a device failed or there was some malfunction in a device, and that was enough justification to bring us into triage and prove that, first of all, there was no adversary or no evidence to support an adversary, and secondly, that cyber may or may not have even contributed to the event. When I say cyber, I'm talking about network communications. So kind of surprising initially, but when you consider that a lot of these services are client-facing, if there is a lapse in service, if there is some malfunction that drops service down, the impact to clients can be substantial. And so we've seen legal teams and even some regulatory standards now requesting that due diligence be applied to rule cyber out. Secondly, again, probably no surprise to anyone on this call, but applying IT solutions laterally does not result in a defensible ICS network. We have done a couple engagements where the client took an EDR, an endpoint detection response agent from the IT space, and did a trial deployment down into the OT DMZ, or even further lower into the Purdue model, and did a trial run for a couple months and ended up pulling the agent out as soon as they saw some adverse effects. Additionally, if you're doing some network monitoring in the IT space, we've seen clients do sample captures from the OT space and ingest that into the IT tool. The motivation is understandable. The problem is that the tool sitting in IT space does not understand the OT network. It doesn't have the context. So where we have seen clients try this, there is either a huge number of false positives or there is a lack of any type of detection. So you need some tool that understands the protocols, that understands the technology, and then is able to decipher adversary type behavior and TTPs in that data. In the IT tool set that is out there currently, it's very difficult to do. A tool may not understand a simple bit being flipped in line when that same bit is flipped multiple times in a given day. Another topic that we've talked about a lot over the years, I think the community has gotten a little bit better with, and that is the IT and OT convergence. It is obvious that the adversaries have already achieved this, whether they are separate teams that are targeting different parts of the network, or however the operation works, the adversary has been successfully pivoting through these networks to get to the end target. When we do architecture assessments and tabletops, part of those engagements are bringing different security teams into the same room and whiteboarding out the network or talking about pains that they have in their current workload. And during a lot of those engagements, we'll have, say, the transmission team come in and then the generation team come in, and they introduce themselves to each other in that meeting. And then we'll see the IT team come in and we do another round of introductions. It's good that the introductions took place on that day. It's unfortunate they didn't take place until then. So if there are liaison programs or job shadowing, a lot of different approaches to get these teams talking, but simple introductions are very valuable. A lot of our clients have said very bluntly, what they're looking for is just someone to call with a simple question. And a lot of times that resource exists within the organization, maybe in a different building or right down the hall from them, but the resource to answer the questions they have is in-house. They just haven't met them yet. So really exposing the staff to the other network security teams sounds very straightforward, but the return is very, very great. Also, I think something that's been kind of exciting for me is doing some engagements where the scope is very wide. We weren't brought in to look at improving a specific widget or unique process, but we were brought in to help design kind of the ideal state. One client that we were working for on this told me that this is how Disney works. So when Disney is planning, say, a Star Wars expansion to a theme park, they design the utopian state without any constraints on budget, time, fire code restrictions. They design the ideal state, and then they apply restrictions to that for implementation. And we have seen clients work in this space as well. Jumping back over to my IT past, one of the greatest recommendations we could give most clients was to do application whitelisting. But that recommendation is not practical to most of the clients we worked with. They would suffer attrition, the entire culture would change, and the rollout would be very difficult. So a lot of times in initial discussions, we would identify that and not put that in the report because the client would lose confidence in us. We don't see that in the IT space at all. Clients want those high level, those very strategic, big, impactful recommendations. They want to improve, even if that includes segmenting the network or re-architecting some subnets. They're very open to it. They want to know what they should do and how to approach it. And so I think the very vast scope is very indicative that the community wants to improve, and they're willing to invest whatever resources are necessary. Certainly goes without saying, but a key bullet here, because it did stand out from 2018, and that is that incident response requires a plan. A lot of regulatory documents and guidance pushed down from advisory entities or advisory boards has verbiage like timely detection of an attack, ability to triage and identify, ability to mitigate. And it speaks more towards the capability rather than how to do it, which is fine. For a regulatory document, we don't want them to be too technical, or implementation will be difficult. The problem is, for tabletops and a lot of other engagements, we review IRPs, or incident response plans, from our clients. And unfortunately, a lot of the verbiage from the regulatory documents is pasted into the IRP. So it describes a capability, not necessarily how to do it. And during incident response, that document, its usefulness is not fully gathered. So what we really recommend is doing a tabletop, testing those plans to see what needs to be enhanced, what needs more detail, and what doesn't. We've done a number of tabletops for entities with a very dispersed geographical footprint. And on one in question, part of the scenario was pushing a malformed config file up to a certain device, and so when the device restarted, it wouldn't come back up because of that config file. And so as part of the triage effort, the client said, well, we'll go to the other sites and confirm that the config file is correct, which is easy to say, but we need to dial it back and talk about the resources that are required. If those sites are geographically dispersed, you may have multiple hours in getting a resource to the site. Additionally, that skill set is very limited. Who has the proper safety and training to go on site? Who has the knowledge to pull this config file out of a device while it's in production and confirm that the config file is sound and legitimate? And so as soon as we put those constraints on it, it may be 1 or 2 people in the organization, and what was a good idea now may take 2 weeks to actually implement. So developing an IRP that is not just fulfilling of the regulation, but practical and applicable to the environment, and then testing that is one of the greatest returns I think any organization can do for IR planning. And then finally, back to Ben's point, consistent monitoring continues to be the most common tactical and strategic recommendation that we give. And I've had some pushback when people say, well, this is strategic. It isn't tactical at all. Deploying network monitoring across our vast network with multiple subnets and network address translation devices deployed throughout is very costly. And so they try to push it out to a strategic standpoint. And my reply to that is, without understanding the battlefield, you can't develop any other strategy. I think too often we rely on tools to justify their existence. Deploy this IPS and let it report how many threats it stopped without validating it. In order to really calculate the return on investment for any security tool, in order to properly prioritize what security tools you need, you have to have monitoring across the environment. You have to know what you are defending against. So, ultimate problem statement, ICS networks have to be defensible. I think we all understand that now. Everyone on the webinar today is here because they acknowledge this. we approach that by asking really three different questions. What is on my network? Is my network under attack? And how do I respond to threats or compromise? Approaching all three of these doesn't need to be done in a linear fashion. You can work them in tandem, but completing one will facilitate the next. So what is on my network? Having a basic asset inventory, completing a CMF, like the white paper that Ben mentioned. Just being able to identify vendors, the topology, the architecture of the network, down to what assets are on it, will help you understand what is on your network, and then you can prioritize additional improvements or security control deployment throughout that. The second is my network under attack. Asking if my network is under attack really requires some level of understanding of what is on your network. That requires environment visibility, maybe proactive hunting and looking at vulnerabilities. And then finally, how do I respond to threats or compromise? And this goes back to the incident response planning that we spoke about. Performing exercises, developing playbooks. If you do outsource some incident response, or you set up a retainer with someone, establish those relationships now, and don't just sign the contract. Exchange network information. Really share what is on your network now, so if there is an incident, the team can hit the ground running rather than spending a couple hours catching up. Additionally, completing each one of these will drive further questions up and allow you to enhance the previous question. So is my network under attack? Well, that I really need to calculate what security controls do I have that I can leverage to do triage, to investigate. What is the potential impact if something is under attack? Both of those questions require me to be able to say what is on my network. How do I respond? Really, I have to know what the threat is. What are the TTPs? What is the adversary targeting? What are they after and how are they operating? Without knowing that, I really can't do incident response effectively. And in order to know that, I have to identify initially if my network is under attack. So the most common question we get from all of our clients is that they understand, again, the threat landscape. They know they have to improve security, they want to improve, but they don't know where to start. There are still a lot of buzzwords out there in the industry, hunting and modeling, intelligence, and lots of different pegs that the client could buy. The problem is they aren't sure, again, how to calculate the return on investment. Some sound more exciting than others. Threat intelligence program or penetration testing. But the return on investment to the client won't be as great if they aren't ready for that type of service. So part of our messaging when we first talk to a client is identifying where they're at in their security posture, identifying what capabilities they have now, and then trying to develop iterative steps for them to get to that ideal state. So we break this down to establish, enable, and enhance capabilities. And we need to remember that we still have those three basic questions. What is on my network? Is it under attack? And how do I respond? All three of those questions, we have to have a basic capability in. We have to establish and know what we are defending. We can then enable the team to do better, understand their capabilities. What capabilities do I have to identify whether or not my network is under attack? What do I have that will facilitate response? And do I know how to do that? Is my team enabled to complete the action? And then enhancing that capability is done through, again, exercises, testing, and being able to adapt as needed. So breaking our services down across each one of these. And it's not important to say, this is a Dragos webinar, and so we're talking about Dragos things, but really to do any of these, to do vulnerability assessment, you have a couple options. You can train internal staff, you can hire new staff, you can hire an external company like Dragos, or you may have the capability already in-house. Either way, it's an investment. If you have the capability in-house, the investment is time. So it isn't just what services Dragos offers, it's if you're looking to enhance or establish any of these capabilities, it will require some investment. So using penetration testing as an example, if you're going to invest in penetration testing and you haven't done a basic vulnerability mapping across your network, the return on investment may not be as great. You may have penetration testing testers that are looking down a rabbit hole into a low consequence, low availability exercise. Doing a full architecture assessment and vulnerability assessment across your network will help you better target the penetration testers to the maybe large availability, large consequence issues. And so really, again, kind of building on what you have, taking those iterative steps will help every investment have a better return on investment. And I feel this is validated when we again look at the breakdown of our services last year, where a little bit more than 52% were focused on knowing what the clients were defending, doing basic architecture assessments and training events for the staff so they have that established capability. The next step, where we talk about, again, the vulnerability assessments and proactive threat assessments, that's really enabling your team to be able to pivot and focus on where they need to. And then finally, penetration testing, threat hunting, and tabletops. I guess the core is, because they're exciting words, because they are buzzwords in the industry, we have a lot of clients reach out. They want to invest in the penetration tests or the proactive threat hunting. And we really encourage kind of stepping back, looking at the base capabilities, looking at how the team is enabled, and making sure that where their investment is, whether or not it's an internal investment or they do contract with Dragos, that the return on investment is something that they can make use of, that they can really get the full return on investment for. So as Ben mentioned, this has all been wrapped into a white paper, a year in review white paper that is available on the Dragos website. And we're pretty quick on time, about 12:34, so I can address any questions if they pop up. If you don't get a question in, or you don't want to post it publicly, feel free to shoot Ben or I a message and we can address it after the fact there as well. Excellent. I see a couple people hitting up out of bounds and no public questions coming in. So if you do send us a message, we'll get back to you later on this afternoon. Thank you everyone for coming, and have a fantastic week.